For the Akan, the answer wasn't always war, exile, or rebellion. It was institutionalized sexuality. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't criminal, it was public, organized, and in some spaces even considered sacred.
新物种，天生愧愧都在生活孙悟空，连找我也找不到的，正在看着看我 King Style 成为国王。那些女孩面前尖叫为我凤凰，接着4年全部都想做我新娘。幸福混乱开始嗡嗡轰，后面的引起任何冲动，假使越野怪兽蜂拥，欢呼着冒险家的恐龙。那些弱者是否看到我的脸都怕？如今迅速即将超越跨入新时代，穿过时空隧道，洞里暗示密宝，在与对手过招得到绝世技巧。我们穿越了森林后，他们停顿在尽头。
Today, we're uncovering a story that's really told, one that lives quietly in the margins of history, yet it has shaped how generations of women, men, and communities have understood power, sexuality, and justice. In this episode, we journey into the pre-colonial world of the Akan people, which is known as present-day Ghana, to explore a system so complex and ethically challenging that it redefines everything that we think we know about morality, gender, and even the purpose of sex. Today, we are diving deep into a fascinating and often misunderstood aspect of history. I think that when we consider pre-colonial African societies, we often carry with us our modern biases. But what if I told you that the concept of sexuality, marriage, and even what we call prostitution is far more complex and nuanced than you might ever imagine? Our main source today is from a scholarly article titled Sexuality and Prostitution Amongst the Akan of the Gold Coast by Emmanuel Achampong. I have linked it in my bio description below, so do make sure that you check it out. And with that, like, subscribe before we get into the video of today. Well, here's a question that I think no one is asking, and that is what happens when too many young men can't marry because the elderly men already have all the wives? What does the society do with that frustration and with that imbalance? Well, for the Akan, the answer wasn't war or exile or rebellion. The answer was institutionalized sexuality. This wasn't hidden, it wasn't criminal, but it was public, organized, and by some even considered as sacred. So, who are the Akan? The Akan are one of the most historically influential ethnic groups in West Africa. They are known for their gold trade, matrilineal kinship system, and deep reverence for ancestors. They built kingdoms like Asante and Fante long before the European colonizers arrived. Their society were matrilineal, meaning that inheritance came through the mother's line, but make no mistake, that power, especially political and sexual power, was often held by men, and senior men to be specific. In this structure, your status as a man depended not on your age or wealth, but on how many wives you had. And here's the kicker. The more wives a chief had, the fewer that were left for younger men. And so this introduces us to a term known as gerontocracy, which means rule by the elders. In the Akan world, this didn't just mean decision making, it meant control over land, resources, and women. Older men took multiple wives, a system which we know as polygamy, which was seen as a sign of strength and prestige. But the result of this was a large population of unmarried, frustrated young men. And this is where it gets fascinating. These men weren't just bachelors. They were often economically disempowered because marriage brought labor, farmland access, and social standing. And so to fix this crisis, the Akan didn't punish the youth. They created a system where women could serve a public role, and literally they were called public women as part of this social contract. So public women were not simply prostitutes. And I think this is where the story really gets interesting, when we start seeing the difference between a public woman and what we understand in modern day as prostitutes. The word really doesn't do justice to their status. They were a recognized institution, often tied to the chief or village structure. These public women had specific roles, and that was mostly sexually serving unmarried men, maintaining social peace, and in many cases avoiding the threats of violence or rebellion from the surplus of bachelors that was there. And here's the ethical curveball. Some of these women were slaves, many were war captives or women assigned by lineage heads, and they were expected to sexually serve an entire community of men. But they also had power, and as such, they rose in rank. Others had economic independence, especially in markets, as their visibility meant that they weren't shamed in the way that we would imagine today. The institution of public women was deeply embedded in the political and moral economy of the pre-colonial Akan society. Male elders controlled land and agricultural production, and labor was drawn from wives and dependents. Access to women was unequal, making them a valuable economic good. Wealthy men invested in the sexuality of women, and polygamy was bolstered by the importance of female economic and biological reproduction. In smaller communities where polygamy by wealthy elders could cause a serious imbalance in sex ratios, public women acted as a stabilizing force, preventing social rupture between elders and young men. However, this also presented problems. It could devalue marriage and lead to spiritual and social crises due to the perceived volatile power of sex. Promiscuity was seen as an anomaly, something out of place, and so the Akan culture emphasized that female sexuality must always be controlled, primarily by male and female elders. Marriage was the proper context for sexual desires, and monogamy and fidelity was stressed for women. Unmarried adult women were always viewed as rejecting the social order. Intriguingly, the rituals surrounding the initiation of public women were similar to puberty rites and the installation of chiefs or even priestesses. This suggests a deep ritual significance, perhaps to spiritually neutralize the danger of promiscuity and integrate them into recognized social status. Some historical accounts even described public women as fetish women, highlighting the religious undertones that existed. This system raised huge ethical questions. Was it empowering? Was it exploitative? Was it practical? And the truth is that it was all of the above. The Akan moral universe wasn't simply based on these ideas of purity versus sin. It was about balance, responsibility, and public harmony. Sex wasn't private, it was communal, political, and managed. And while these women were often living in the margins of their society, their existence wasn't necessarily deemed as insignificant, but rather they upheld the core values of their society, bringing stability, hierarchy, and respect for elders. So, what happens then when the colonizers arrived? Well, British colonial officers, Christian missionaries, and coastal trading posts really did bring about a huge change. The arrival of colonialism brought significant changes. It brought the expansion of commerce and industry, coupled with male migrant labor, and the presence of Europeans in towns created new economic opportunities for women. Unlike the pre-colonial public women, modern prostitutes in the colonial Gold Coast asserted their independence and accumulated wealth for themselves. These women, often outsiders with no kinship ties in the town, found a niche for themselves within the colonial system. The male-dominated urban economy, combined with the colonial state's unwillingness to provide for the social reproduction of this labor force, led to a sexual imbalance in working-class towns. Prostitution became an integral strategy for newly arrived women to secure temporary residence and capital. What fascinated and horrified many was that these women voluntarily stepped out of the traditional social constructs. They became symbols of autonomy, thus influencing perceptions of prostitutions. They were often seen as pacemakers because of their social drinking, fashionable clothing, and independent lifestyles. These women accumulated wealth, owned houses, and even had savings, demonstrating a material horizon previously unavailable to many women. With colonization came new definitions of morality. European missionaries criminalized public women, labeling them as sinners, prostitutes, and witches. The state outlawed their role, but this didn't solve the deeper issues of the social frustration when it came to gender imbalances as well as youth unrest. Instead, colonization replaced a regulated institution with underground suffering. This wasn't progress, it was moral imposition, and the trauma of that moral rewriting still echoes in our society today. Colonialism acted as a catalyst in restructuring gender relations. It weakened the authority of chiefs and male elders, and it introduced a cash economy where women found more avenues to assert their autonomy and redefine their expectations in marriage. The dual legal structure of British and customary law courts allowed women to strategically manipulate the law in their favor. Female accumulation strengthened female sexual autonomy, thereby enabling women to prune the male-dominated institution of marriage. Rural women increasingly withdrew their labor from exploitative husbands and uncles. Sexuality, marital obligations, and the concept of family became fiercely contested. The rhetoric of rural male elders often blamed women's assertiveness and accumulation for the marital instability that was taking place, and often weaponized the term or label of prostitute. This period saw a rise in concerns about prostitution and disease, particularly in the bustling economic centers. The term prostitution became a label deployed against female assertiveness, especially when women opted out of marriage, which was seen as the ultimate goal for some women within Akan culture. Male hegemony was threatened when women pursued independence and wealth outside traditional marital structures. However, that said, it's crucial to note that marriage and prostitution were not mutually exclusive. Some women, even those with missionary education, embraced this era of female independence and sexual autonomy. They supported their children through trading, and thus choosing not to marry or live with the fathers highlighted a desire for flexibility and control over their lives. So, what is it that we learn here today? The history of sexuality and prostitution among the Akan of the Gold Coast reveals a very complex interplay of indigenous social structures, economic shifts, and colonial influences. Public women and prostitutes, though distinct, both represent critical junctures along the fault lines of gender relations. Public women were disempowered by their lack of sexual autonomy, while colonial-era prostitutes empowered themselves by asserting control over their sexuality and accumulating wealth. This challenges simplistic narratives and highlights how women navigated changing landscapes to redefine their selfhood. This historical lens encourages us to really examine prostitution not merely as social defiance, but as a contested sphere of gender relations where women sought to redefine their roles and assert their agency. It reminds us that African societies had diverse and dynamic understandings of gender and sexuality long before colonial intervention, and that these historical complexities continue to shape contemporary discussion. This story matters because it shows us how African societies found their own ways of managing power, sexuality, and community tensions long before colonialism. It really challenges the binary thinking that says that women were always just victims or that sex work is always shameful. It reminds us that morality has a history and that not all systems of sexuality are Western. Today, as we debate women's bodies, rights, and freedoms, we need to remember stories like these where women aren't just private citizens, but at some point were used as public answers to public problems. Whether we approve of the system or not, the story of the Akan's public woman deserves to be remembered, not erased, not sanitized, but simply studied with honesty and care. So with that, I'd like to know, what do you think about this institution of public woman? Do you think that it was a solution or a symptom? Let me know in the comments section, and let's build a community where we are not afraid to explore complex and untold stories. With that, like, subscribe, share, and see you soon in the next one. Bye.